In Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, he contrasts two attitudes of the European soul: the Apollonian spirit, based on tangible limits and the conditions of the present, and the Faustian spirit, whose thrust is the attainment of the infinite, as well as historical consciousness and progress. For Spengler, classical culture was an expression of Apollonianism. States were small and empires had their limits. Mathematics had yet to even conceive of the infinite, or the idea of zero as a basis for all numbers, therefore restricting mathematics to that which is tangible and has measurable form. Classical man lived in the present and viewed the world through and as symbol or myth. The idea of progress was, as a result, inconceivable because the fullness of the present moment and all of its symbolic depth dominated. Reality was already complete and essentially imminent. Starting with Christianity, the Western world began to move toward a view of transcendence and consequently began to discover and elaborate on the idea of the infinite, a discovery which had previously been delimited to Eastern culture, such as in the Vedanta. The level of abstraction increased and man ceased living in the moment. Instead, Western man became conscious of itself as a living participant in the current of history and time, of things having become rather than things becoming. This was the genesis of modern science, which, according to Spengler, is the arrangement of things become as hard-set laws, such as the laws of nature, nature here understood in the modern sense of the term. The idea of the Faustian spirit is derived from Goethe's Faust plays, in which the main character, Heinrich Faust, makes a deal with Mephistopheles, or the devil, to have a permanent experience of transcendence. In other words, he trades the here and now and the limits of his ordinary condition in a failed attempt to gain the expansion and transformation of his consciousness. This basic theme, trading limits for horizons, is the foundation for Spengler's Faustian spirit, which he extends to the historical behavior of Western man. This Faustian spirit is manifested in Western colonialism, in imperialism, in the Industrial Revolution, in the American Manifest Destiny, in globalization, and the indefinite expansion of capital and technology. This Faustian spirit, however, sets up unattainable goals, which leads to its own downfall. The desire to grasp the infinite and to confine it into finite space is the essence of madness, and infinity always ends this effort by disintegrating whatever tries to do so, just as a vessel bursts into fragments when under extreme pressure. Society is held together by certain limits, and the effort to do away with such limits ultimately undermines said civilization. Spengler's view of decline centers around the notion that all civilizations started out as cultures, and that cultures possessed a living understanding and relationship with reality. But over time, as becoming is eclipsed by a historically conscious view of things become, cultures become civilizations cut off from the original faculties of intuition and feeling that inspired them. The vigor of a society is essentially this feeling. For Spengler, this is evident in classical mathematics. For example, because the ancient Greeks primarily dealt with tangible form in their waking lives, they did not conceive of negative numbers nor irrational numbers. Instead, they only worked with positive numbers and whole numbers, just as waking reality itself is positive and whole. They were actually superstitiously fearful of the concept of negative or irrational numbers, believing them to have some kind of malign or terrible quality, a negation of the good. It was only after the classical number feeling had eroded that the mathematicians of the West began interpreting classical math in an abstract direction, in contravention of the intuitions that had inspired that math. So, Western math eventually diverged from its classical inspiration and came to know zero as a number, infinity, negative numbers, numbers as relations such as functions, or mathematical irrationals, none of which have a tangible representation. Western mathematical abstraction reached such depths that it became impossible to actually represent some geometric equations visually, especially after the introduction of the notion of n-dimensional space. Western math is clearly very far from classical number feeling, so it has essentially become a hard-set study of abstract laws, no longer a living and tangible reality evident to the senses expressed in the mode of art. We can also see, having the benefit of time that Spengler did not, the gradual dissolution of artistic form in lockstep with the development of abstract math following his observation that mathematics is actually the secret basis of all art. We see in modern and in postmodern art the destruction of positive form, the victory of the irrational and the formless. Spengler's intuition was such that even Julius Evola had seen quite the same, that Dadaism, an abstract art movement that he had participated in within Italy, was essentially motivated by a desire to grasp the transcendent. In other words, it was Faustian and a sign of decline. For Spengler, cultures and civilizations are organic beings. In other words, they have a series of life stages as well as a lifespan. Culture is society in its infancy, while civilization is the twilight of a society. Having lost its cultural vigor, modern civilization continues to march on for a time, engaging in essentially empty expansionism until its energy runs out and it collapses. Western civilization, then, is certainly in its twilight years. Unbridled economic expansion has resulted in various crises, the first of which is a demographic crisis. Birth rates have declined, but in order to maintain expansion of wealth and production, civilizations require an expanding population of producers. To offset the problem, states have decided to begin a program of mass immigration of foreigners who have higher birth rates, since interventions to increase native birth rates tend not to have very satisfactory results. Of course, a lot of this mass immigration is a form of hostility against natives, which we can't underestimate, but the public justification is, at least, an attempt to maintain economic prosperity. The gradual replacement of the native population that this mass immigration causes must necessarily cause a further decline in culture and feeling. Having nothing in common with the immigrants, Westerners gradually lose their culture. Life becomes a rote exercise guided by laws and postmodern morality. Becoming is replaced by the having become. The vigor of civilization then also declines, and a competency crisis sets in, which further damages the possibility of modern civilization maintaining its progress. This demographic crisis is, in part, driven by the mania of capitalist wealth expansion. Capitalism requires indefinite growth to remain stable, since a decline in growth would turn investments into liabilities. These problems, the collapse of culture feeling, the death of competency, and capitalism reaching its limits of expansion, contribute further to the decline of the West. Just as Rome's expansion forced it to deal with hostile populations that would eventually spell its end, the West's expansion has caused it to demolish its own center in favor of an assemblage of foreign interests. Not only has the expansion of capital been disastrous, but also the present expansion of technology can serve to further the West's decline. Culture is essentially a human phenomenon, and if what Spengler says is true, that culture is the vigor behind society, then the collapse of culture would spell an end to what we call the West. Postmodernism already made a momentous step in the destruction of unique culture by splitting it apart and individualizing it, then taking to indiscriminately blending cultures in a bid for what it calls quote-unquote diversity. But technology will be capable of automating the destruction of culture. AI is capable of creating art, music, literature, and other things that once were the prerogative of human culture. But to say that AI creates these things is somewhat dubious, because in reality all it does is blend together the input data heuristically. The more AI is trained on its own creations, the more it is subject to generation decay. The outputs become less and less original and convincing, becoming erroneous and noisy. The more civilization becomes reliant on AI for cultural output, the more that culture will decline. Since AI is something of a cultural blender, and since it corrupts whatever we put into it, if the usage of AI in art becomes widespread, it will end originality. Only humans are capable of originality, and originality, or a uniqueness, based on the inimitable personal experience of the artist, is the driving engine of culture. The rise of the machines is the end of all things human. And if what we call the West is a human phenomenon, the post-human singularity will end it decisively. With technology and with capitalism comes globalization. Something Spengler perhaps did not see was the convergence of all cultures and civilizations into a global melting pot. The Faustian mania for expansion has brought Western civilization all around the globe, and as a result, it has stretched that civilization to its breaking point. It no longer means anything special to be Western, because what culture remains has already been commodified and sold to the world. Everyone today operates according to Western methods. The Chinese are engaging in empirical research according to the Western method. India is building rockets. North Korea is developing nukes. Cities of all major countries are beginning to look identical, with brutalist, efficient buildings, meticulously planned streets, and looming skyscrapers. Progress that was at one point unique to the West is now no longer a Western phenomenon, and the more this development continues, the less the West can even claim to exist. If the ultimate demographic death blow is carried out, then there will be absolutely nothing left that is Western, save for a direction on a map. Because feeling was replaced by knowing, or at least the point at which feeling and knowing form a nexus is no longer realized, we're today left with a standardized culture of things become, no longer a living relationship with our land, with our people, nor with nature. To the Greeks, the universe represented a cosmos of living beings. To us, it's simply another frontier for human greed and expansion. Ancient man was content to contemplate the planets from Earth, while we salivate over the possibility of shooting a rocket toward Mars and putting human feet there, erstwhile transforming the cosmos into a mass of atoms. Wonder has been replaced with an insatiable craving, and that craving will eventually end by burning itself out once its irrationality is finally understood. All the while, there has been an inevitable dissolution of the qualitative, a turn toward uniformity, formlessness, and dispersion. The Faustian attitude has caused all the crises today that we are witnessing: the collapse of borders, the relentless expansion of capital, the cynical view that economic progress is the raison d'etre of life, and the myth of progress more generally. The ideal of progress, no matter what its object is definitively Faustian, and what most proponents of this Faustian spirit seem to ignore is that the postmodern left are Faustians par excellence. Progress has no endpoint. It stretches out toward the infinite. At no point can we say that we have finally accomplished progress. If the West wants to save itself, insofar as such salvation is possible, then it needs to turn against this tendency that, according to Spengler, has dominated life since at least the 10th century. If we were to turn against capitalism, then economic downscaling would not be fatal and could even be positive. If we were to turn against technical expansion, then we might be forced to live in a more sustainable way, rather than holding out with Luciferian hope that we might be able to invent bacteria that can turn trash into petroleum and plastic into food. The only reason the elites need us to eat bugs is so we can beat Malthusianism and increase the teeming masses in the name of progress, so that the elite can have more meaningless wealth than they already have. If we really want to be against this, we have to be against the Faustian spirit. Just like Faust, our society has sold its soul to the devil of progress. The task remains for us to steal it back in the name of tradition. What is at the root of this problematic Faustian spirit is fundamentally a spiritual error. The belief that the earth and our waking reality is somehow incomplete has driven us to reach out for the infinite, as if something unattainable like progress could complete us. The truth is that reality is already complete. It is itself a manifestation of that infinity. The myth of progress is the myth that we must seek something outside of ourselves to be whole, and that somehow our relationship with the absolute can be better, not worse, if we plunder everything in sight and disparage the present, supposedly in the name of the infinite. In reality, by doing so, we become hostile to that infinity. As René Guénon established, speed is abolition of the present into the future. Modern civilization is founded on speed, on the endless mania for expansion and progress. If the West wants to avert collapse, it needs to turn toward its Apollonian roots, toward the dimension of the present and the full symbolic and metaphysical depth of reality. As long as we believe reality is just dust to be shaped according to our good pleasure, including increasingly the human form, we will continue digging our graves. In other words, we must reject speed. We must reject the insane Faustian deal of trading the here and now for the unreachable horizons of the future. Futurism is reverse Gnosticism, the belief that we can escape our unfortunate conditions by leaping into vaster masses of matter. The myth of space travel is that at some point we can abandon Earth and find something of equal or greater worth in space. It's a myth because no matter how much we have tried, we've been incapable of finding another Earth. This is the only one that we have, and if we trade it for space in a literal sense, we're giving up our birthright, just as Esau did for a pot of porridge. Globalism carries out the same despicable trade. Our homeland is traded for the world. Our own culture is given up so we can have every other culture. This is what the Faustian spirit, at its core, really is. Now, I want to end on a few criticisms that I have of Spengler, because even if he is an insightful guy and a lot of what he says is true, that doesn't mean that his thought is without faults. Spengler likes to reduce history down to what he calls physiognomics, a vague notion of similarity and correspondence within what he calls historical morphology, and also a vague notion of destiny, which is linked to the irreversibility of time, as well as, for lack of a better word, the becomingness of time. This sense of destiny is essentially fatalistic. No action is possible that can avert it, and each man has to live out his fate. Each civilization must live out its fate and acquiesce to Faustianism in the end. My greatest fear is that if Spengler's worldview becomes more widespread, we're going to have a lot of little Spenglers running around with their own physiognomic of history and their own vague artistic idea of each nation or race's destiny. They're going to make mountains out of their little subjective molehills, trying to make absolute these notions while carrying forth Spengler's practical denial of historical causality and historical action. In the first place, historical causality is important because it allows us to understand in part why some things have happened, what led to the tyranny of Napoleon, the French Revolution, and the death of the Ancien regime, what led to the French Revolution, the spread of Freemasonry throughout Europe, what led to communism, the revolution of Lenin. Of course, we could do as Spengler recommends and try to insert ourselves into living history and try to feel the destinies of the Freemasons or of Lenin. But other than serving as an empty reactionism in the domain of history, how is this of any use to us? If you wanted to prevent these things, you would be utterly disarmed without a causal view of history and would be incapable of identifying the people and groups responsible for change in the first place. There is ultimately this anti-intellectual element in Spengler's thought, in which he wants to relegate everything that has a definite principle to the dustbin of dead things or things become. This is a problem because if you can't identify a common principle behind correspondences, those correspondences might just be coincidences with no causal relationship. Spengler's history, in that case, becomes an exercise in useless pretension and fantasy. A lot of people are going to compare Spengler and Julius Evola due to the superficial similarity of their historical views. Spengler thought that nations were like living beings with a life cycle, and Evola, with his theory of the regression of the castes, which he got from Guénon, thought that civilizations and the world undergo a cycle of decay and renewal according to metaphysical laws. The difference between their views, however, is that Evola posits actual principles behind his regression of the castes and does not reject an intellectual explanation, whereas Spengler was simply drawing artistic or physiognomic parallels between, say, biology and what he saw in the decline of civilizations. Spengler's view is essentially baseless, while Evola's view is based on the traditional principle of the world cycle, which states that everything that enters into manifestation, since it is imperfect, begins to decay, reaches a terminal point, then must be recreated or renewed in the end by the supreme principle. This is well established in most religions, actually, the notion that things get worse over time, the idea of an apocalypse or the end times, and then an inevitable restoration, or a new heaven and a new earth. Spengler and Evola are basically talking past each other. Spengler hesitates to give a thorough treatment of being, opting instead to ground his philosophy in the experience of becoming and time. Even worse, he makes a fundamental mistake of metaphysics in supposing that time precedes space, and that symbols are dead, hard-set things, or the having become, rather than living in conscious spiritual realities. Rather than Spengler, Evola turned to the timeless, toward being itself, to explain the course of history, treating what occurs in the realm of becoming as a manifestation of what is eternally true in being. Space comes before time. Time is the unfolding of space in sequence. Space is related to quality or symbol, and time to quantity or matter. As such, there isn't really as much agreement between the two philosophers as some people, cough cough, Dickie Spencer, seem to believe. Spengler thinks he has found the death blow to modern philosophy, i.e. Kant, by turning away from intellectual principle and instead toward time. But in reality, from a traditionalist point of view, he has actually placed himself below modern philosophy into the nebulous realm of feelings and experiences. One might be tempted to see in Spengler almost a psychology of history rather than a symbolic treatment of it, and arguably he is much closer to the postmodernists than to the traditionalists, especially considering the roots of that philosophy in psychoanalysis. Spengler asks us to look toward a history of histories, or a multiplicity of valid views of the world, each one unique and unrepeatable, rather than bringing us toward the incontrovertible and the eternal. For Spengler, the soul is something mysterious and inaccessible other than through vague feelings or impressions, simply an assumed and confused prior to becoming. For Evola, the soul, or the absolute spirit more properly speaking, is the very basis of a whole specified worldview. The worlds of Spengler and Evola are in reality very far apart, and since Evola's view is much more absolute and coherent, I would contend that it has much more capacity for forming a stable political paradigm rather than the multiplicity of intuited destinies that Spengler offers. It should be no surprise, after all, that member of the Frankfurt School Theodore W. Adorno praised certain aspects of Spengler's history. Of course, the praise that someone gets can't determine the worth of his philosophy, but it certainly can tell us the way in which the wind is blowing, and hence the direction that it brings us to in the end. In that sense, the appropriation that Dickie Spencer once made of Spengler's thought to facilitate pan-European great politics in the Nietzschean style, on the basis of a will-to-power-driven manifest destiny, is understandable. The postmodern world, based in part on the developments of the Frankfurt School, is a world in which power is the only determinant of truth, and Spencer's worldview was essentially just Spenglerian subjective destiny plus power, a power that, since it is Faustian, is in its death throes, in other words, condemned to hell. We can praise Spengler for his brilliant insight into the causes of the decline of nations, his erudite treatment of art and culture, as well as his finding that a living relationship with the soul of things is essential to the greatness of peoples and races. But as for his methodology of world history, philosophy, and destiny, I think we can put that in the trash.